And I again want to begin by wishing the church all the best in its future and thanking Mary Jo Eastwood for having this opportunity to share the life of one of the most amazing women I've had the opportunity to study about, who happens to also be our next door neighbor. About 150 years ago, but nonetheless, next door neighbor. I began my research with a book that my wife had a role in writing, which is called The 20th Century History of Beaver County. In this book, I looked up Sara, and Sara's story is listed as an unknown celebrity. She becomes lost to history in the 20th century, and that's a shame. And hopefully tonight we're going to be able to help rectify that issue too. In this book, Sara is described as a poet, a news writer, a war correspondent, an abolitionist, an American patriot, a novelist, an entrepreneur, and one of the leading social activists of the 19th century in the women's movement. Just a note of how I keep track of this, her life. I'm going to mention her age a lot because the changes happen so rapidly in her life that it's hard to believe that what happens to her in just 1 year. So by citing her age, it allows you to track the incredible differences that happened to her throughout her life. Now my story begins 200 years ago when Sara is born in Pompey, New York on September 23rd. So her birthday is coming up, 1823, 2023. We're not far from her birthday. Her mother is Deborah Baker Clark, and her father is Thaddeus Clark, and he is a physician, so it's Dr. Thaddeus Clark. They had 11 children, and Sara was the youngest of the children. When I was looking up Sara's life, I always like to look at going into the lineage of a person's life, and I found that Sara's life goes all the way back to the Pilgrims. She is one of the original founding Pilgrims, great-great-great-great-granddaughters. And her family lineage through her mother begins with her great-grandfather is Reverend Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was an Anglican preacher or minister, and he was known as America's theologian. America's theologian. This is because he was a leader in what was called the Great Awakening of the 18th century. This movement had strong implications for the foundation of the United States of America and our Constitution because it preached the doctrine that all people are created equally. And Jonathan Edwards was the leader of that movement. And again, he was an Anglican minister. Next, through Jonathan Edwards, is his great-grandmother, Elizabeth Tuttle, who was born in a place called New Haven, which is where the Pilgrims landed. And New Haven becomes the state of Connecticut. This underscores the strong spiritual foundation that became part of Sara Clark Lippincott's life. Sara begins her life on her parents' beautiful farm in Pompey, New York. Again, her father was a physician, and he practiced medicine right from his home on the farm. His elder sons ran the farm. They did the actual farming, and they also ran a livery service, which their dad used to make house calls with, and they used to make money to support that 16 children family, and they also sold horses. But they also raced them on the property, and little Sara, as a little girl, becomes a very skilled rider by the age of 10, get this, 10 years of age. One morning, her parents are sitting on the front porch of their place in Pompey, New York, having a cup of coffee, and little Sara runs out in front of them, 10 years of age, barefooted, and says, "Mom, Dad, watch this!" And she runs into the field, jumps on to her favorite horse, who has no saddle on it. She gets up onto the back of the horse, barefooted. The horse is barebacked, and she whistles, and the horse takes off running and runs right by her parents, and she waves at them, "Hi, Mom and Dad, hi, Mom and Dad." And they were just shocked and scared to death. But she then slides back down on the horse and rides up to him and says, "Wasn't that something, Mom?" And she said, "Just don't ever do that again." But at 10 years of age, this stunt of Sara also shows you the bold and courageous character that underscored her life and was a defining influence through her next 80 years. In 1835, that's just 2 years later, Sara is 12 and she moves to Rochester, New York from Pompeii, New York. And her parents do something for her which was unusual for a woman at the time. They send her to school, and she attends school for the next 8 years. And a historian of the time that was writing about Sara, who again was very famous, so a lot was written about her, says Sara's favorite subjects were literature, which sounds normal for a person who becomes a writer. But she also learned how to speak Latin, do math problems, and read and write too. And by the age of 13, 1 year later, Sara begins her professional career as a writer. 13. She's only went to school formally for just 1 year, and she's already a writer. Her teachers told the Rochester, New York newspaper about the stories and poems that Sara was writing. And he looked at him and he said, "Wow, these are really interesting. Kids will love to read this." So he prints them in his publication. And Sara is an overnight celebrity in Rochester, New York. She begins to earn a few cents for every poem they publish. And for the next 3 years, she continues writing poems that are placed in the newspaper. But by the age of 16, she now becomes a real writer. She looks into issues on the woman's side and political issues at 16. And she begins to write articles at 16 in a Rochester newspaper, Rochester, New York newspaper. Her articles are known as fresh and spicy, and even a little racy. And when you have a chance to read some of Sara's writings, you'll notice that. 3 years later, Sara's father hears about a place that is a kind of a boom town in western Pennsylvania. It's called New Brighton, Pennsylvania. And he said to his wife, "We're going to take the whole family down to this boom town. We're going to move into a house I just bought on the main street of town, White Cottage." And so the whole family moves into New Brighton, and Sara is 18 years of age. Again, she's a pretty well-known writer in New York and Pennsylvania at 18, and she decides her father decides that it's important for her to go to New Brighton's Greenwood Institute, and she starts that last year of her education in New Brighton. And I did some research, and I read an article that was published in the 1897 magazine called the Beaver Falls Review. And they were writing a story, 77 years of age at that time when they were writing this story. They were writing the story of when Sara came to Beaver County. The Clark family moved, and I'm quoting from the article, in 1842, the Clarks moved into their new home, which adjoined the Christ Episcopal Church. Sara attended New Brighton's local ladies' academy called Greenwood Institute, and she graduated a year later at age 20. Later in life, Sara said that she had studied her study time at Greenwood Institute was so important that she would honor the Institute the rest of her life by calling herself Grace Greenwood, and use that as her pen name. Sara immediately begins writing after she graduates from the Greenwood Institute for the Saturday Evening Post. She also is hired to write for Godey's Lady Journal, the Home Journal, and the New York Mirror magazine. 4 publications. She's writing all over the North already, the northern states already, and she's still a relative young person. At this time, she's having lived in New Brighton, she becomes exposed to the abolitionists, and she becomes a part of the abolitionist movement. She begins to write serious articles about the abolition of slavery, the Underground Railroad, and the consequences of participating in it. She is against the use of alcohol. She is for temperance. She is for prison reform. She is one of the earliest women's rights leaders who is working for women's suffrage. And how many people know when women were given the right to vote? Anyone guess? You're right. I think that's shocking that this country was that, it was until 1920 that women were denied the right to vote. She also wrote about the horrible conditions a lot of men faced working in the coal mines here and the factories, and wanted the government to do something about protecting the lives of these men that worked so hard to support their families. At this time, only 1 year after her graduation, Sara is one of the best known celebrities in the United States in the 19th century. She's 22. Her writing was already helping to determine the future of our nation's history, and that includes well up into the 20th century. As a writer for the Home Journal magazine at the age of 23 in 1846, Sara receives national recognition for her poem, which is called The Wife's Appeal. And it's very flattering poem to women. And again, that gets national recognition for Sara. Also at this time, in 1846, I mentioned to you about her pen name. At age 23, she quits writing in publications as Sara Jane Clark at that time. She wasn't married yet. Sara Jane Clark, and she begins for the rest of her life to use her pen name of Grace Greenwood. And that's done in their publication in the Home Journal magazine under a story called Tit for Tat. I'm not sure what that's about. At the age of 24, New Brighton presents Sara with a unique opportunity. And it happens right here in front of your church. Dr. Clark, who is well known himself, invites the nation's leading abolitionists to spend a weekend with his family at White Cottage. Those people that he invited included Milo Townsend from New Brighton, who was a local schoolmaster and also had a printing business that also spread his fame throughout the nation. He was noted as one of the nation's most ardent abolitionists. Second on the invitation list is William Lloyd Garrison. He published the nation's first anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator. Garrison soon finds out the cost of being a reformer in the 19th century before the Civil War. In 1835 in Boston, not Atlanta, Georgia, Boston, Massachusetts, his business is broken into, burnt to the ground, He is drug out of the business, taken into the streets, and beaten to what they think is death. And they leave him, he knows what really was going to happen to him, because hours later when he wakes up and he looks up, there's a rope hanging about his neck. What they were really planning on doing was taking him out and lynching him in the main street of Boston, where the Boston Massacre happened. And so much of what makes America great happened in Boston. And you see a pro-slavery rebellion taking place in Boston. A lot of people aren't aware of the pro-slavery movements in places like New York City, Boston, and even Pittsburgh too. And the reason why is because so much of the international trade that took place through ports was due to the cotton trade, and a lot of the machines that were manufacturers used down south came from places like Pittsburgh, and Boston, of course, was a port city too. And the third, and probably the most famous person he invited, was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who found his freedom at the age of 21 in 1838. He works hard for the next 3 years to educate himself, and is invited in 1841 to speak at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Institute. His speech is so powerful that they publish it, and it becomes something that makes him not only nationally famous, but internationally famous. He is soon invited to tour Europe for 3 years to talk about the what it meant to be. He would talk firsthand about what it meant to be a slave and why he was against slavery. What I haven't made clear is he was still legally a slave in the South. A group of people that heard him speak in London thought so much of him, they raised the money and went back to the United States and bought his freedom, got the right paperwork, so that Frederick Douglass could return to the United States as a legally free black man. And that is the third person that ends up at this little meeting that Mr. Clark calls right out there in front of us. During this meeting, Sara forges a personal relationship with all three of these men. It influences her writing and makes her even a more ardent abolitionist. Her articles immediately begin to focus more on the anti-slavery movement than anything else. And Sara lived a total of 8 years back here at White College. And so at the age of 26, Sara moves to New York City, where she's hired as the assistant editor to Godey's Ladies Book, which is a national women's magazine. And Sara was really excited to get this really great job in New York City. She gets to New York City and talks to Mr. Godey, and they're talking about her writing her first articles and stuff. And Mr. Godey is inundated by a series of telegrams and things telling him that everybody in the South knows who Sara is, because she is famous for the articles she published in the National Era, which is a anti-slavery magazine. And so her position as against slavery is well known, and they're going to bankrupt his magazine by canceling all her subscriptions. So he looks at Sara and says, "You're fired." Sara I told you, she was a brave and determined woman. She didn't let this hurt her. She moves quickly to Washington, D.C., and she is hired by the Saturday Evening Post. We even know what that is today. Sara writes for the Saturday Evening Post for the next 50 years of her life. In 1850, Sara meets somebody that probably we've all heard of, Harriet Beecher Stowe, of Uncle Tom Cabin's fame. But when Sara meets her, Harriet hasn't achieved fame. She hasn't been able to get her writings published into a form of a book. And so Sara helps her get her book published as a series of 40 articles in the National Era, which is a national publication. And those 40 articles, Sara helps Harriet Beecher Stowe by editing all of them to make them more readable to her national audience. And they become immediate hit. She takes those 40 articles, publishes them into the book we all know as Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it becomes an overnight bestseller. And our Sarah Clark helped her do this. Not many people are aware of how she helped one of the most famous women in the African American anti-slavery movement, who herself was at one time a slave too. While working with Harriet, Sara had some free time, which is just hard to imagine how. She publishes her own book called Greenwood Leaves. It becomes a national bestseller. It's a series of poems and articles that were said to be a little racy. So I guess it's a word we would call a little sexy today, which was a little unusual for a woman of the 1850s, but that was Sara for you. And they become a national bestseller. We are now at the age of 29 years of age for Sara. You can see why I keep referring to her age, because so many things have happened in her life already, and she's only 29. Now, the New York Times hires her, the New York Times, as the first international correspondent for the Times. International. She gets sent to Europe, and for the next 2 years, she writes her impressions about the different capitals she visits and castles and all that stuff. But can you imagine getting a job where they, oh, we're going to send you for Europe 2 years, and you can just go anywhere you want, all expenses paid, and we're going to pay you money for this. And on top of that, her articles are so appealing that Sara takes them and wraps them up in the form of a book called The Haps and Mishaps of My Tour in Europe, and it becomes a bestseller. Sara, at the age of 30, is financially independent, again, which was really unusual for a woman of that time. That book that I just referred to stays in print for the next 40 years, so she continues to make money off it. Sara, when she returns, she is welcomed as a member of the New York Literary Society, which includes Edgar Allan Poe, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Julia Ward Howe. Her next move upon returning is to move to Philadelphia, where she meets a guy named Leander Lippincott. Hey, that's a lot of alliteration for you. Leander Lippincott. And what was surprising to me, she's 30, and she falls in love with this guy immediately. Within a few weeks, they're married, and she really doesn't look into his background very much. She comes to regret that. A year later, she has her first child and only child, called Annie Grace. Annie Grace will spend the rest of her life with her mother. One of the things that Sara didn't look into when she got married was in the 19th century, the law requires that women are not allowed to own property. That includes the copyrights on the books that she wrote. Her husband, who is a bum, gets control of all these magazines, everything she's written. He's in charge of all of the copyrights. All the money is under his charge. And he's not very good at handling money. And he is also a notorious, she finds out to her great regret, philanderer. But during the first year of her marriage, things do seem to be going pretty well. Her and her husband worked together and published the nation's first child magazine called The Little Pilgrims. This magazine makes her and her husband the most successful couple in the nation of the United States for their overwhelming success in this number of subscriptions they get. This makes her also, in the mid-18th century, successful women are really looked down on. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, which is a very famous writer, writes this column about her in a paper and says, her children's stories are nothing but a bunch of humbug. And she's just another, I'll leave out the swear word. And she is just another scribbling woman that no one should ever take seriously. But Sara is about to face probably the biggest challenge of her life, the American Civil War. Sara's anti-war stance is nationally known, and the New York Times decides to use her as their first woman war correspondent in their history. War correspondent. Sara's down on the front lines. Most of the time the troops aren't fighting, they're just kind of laying around. And she's also a good speaker and is noted for putting on, what today we would call TV shows or something. And she attracts large crowds, charges a lot of money. And with the money, 100% of the money she gives to the United States Sanitary Commission, which is the equivalent of the Red Cross, that cares for all the wounded soldiers, which in that time, remember, there were more wounded and killed soldiers in the Civil War than any other war in our nation's history. And Sara is a large source of funding for them to take care of these soldiers. In a speech by President Abraham Lincoln, when he is talking about famous supporters of the Union cause, he calls out Sara and says that she is a real patriot, and he's thankful for the support, the meaningful support she has given to the war effort. After the war, her husband moves from New York City to Washington, D.C., and she continues to write for the New York Times and the New York Tribune. After the war, she also publishes her recollections of her involvement as a war correspondent during the war, and it is published in the name of a book in 1870 called My Record of 5 Years, which is the 5 years during the Civil War. She also becomes an advocate, and this is, this one really got me. She becomes a strong advocate for women's rights to wear trousers. Historians at the time thought that was a big deal. The women, they didn't want them wearing trousers, but Sarah was right out pitching for women's rights to wear trousers.
They're more comfortable.
And if you can believe that, there was a time in this country women couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, and they couldn't even wear trousers. That's how much things have changed in our country since
Amen.
1776. And a lot of young women aren't aware of the fight that women have had to go through in our country for even the simplest thing, the right to wear trousers. But the most important thing that Sarah was doing this time was joining with Susan B. Anthony to get women the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony and Sarah became so famous that even Congress had to put up with them. They invited them to be the only women ever to go into the Congressional Gallery and be able to ask these bums questions and write down the answers. They didn't like it. They banned women from Congress in 1880, and women were not allowed to be in the congressional building for 40 years. I mean, to me, these are shocking things to find out about what happened to women. But in 1870, Sarah gets a really fantastic opportunity, which I'm going to show you here a little bit. The New York Times and the New York Tribune offer her the chance to write about the real Wild West. As a lone woman, they send her, again, to the real Wild West in 1870. And just to put that in perspective, Custer's Last Stand is 1876. And in this book, when you start reading it, she talks about meeting Native Americans and cowboys. Incidentally, cowboys were bums. That was a term that we've romanticized, but at that time, they were thieves and robbers. And she travels throughout the West, and when she, for 2 years, writes articles that appear in the New York Times and the New York Tribune, and again, she gathered those together and writes, in 1872, this book called New Life in New Lands. Now, this book my wife got me. I haven't finished reading it yet, but it's really fascinating because she talks about being at places that few women had ever been in, the Yosemite Valley and Pikes Peak and all kind of things, a gold mine in California, and she got to meet one of the famous Indian tribe leaders whose name escapes me right now, but it's in the book. And what an adventure she had for 2 years, and comes up with a best-selling book. Again, Leander is taking the money. And at age 53, I told you about her stay in Congress. Well, she is pretty well known in Washington, and Leander is a bum, and he squandered their money. And he says, well, I need a job too. I've put us in debt, and the money that you're making off the books and stuff is paying the debt off. And he said, I need a job. And so she gets him a job in the wildest place I can think of, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And you'd think, what the heck would... But that was a big deal then. Remember, Custer's Last Stand's 1876. So what's happening in the West is with the surviving Native American tribe is really important. His job is to take the money that is to be paid in cash to the Native American tribes who are being forced off their land, and that's why Custer is attacked in 1876. Forced off their lands to go into the Indian Territory. Anybody know where Indian Territory was?
Probably the worst.
Oklahoma. It becomes the state of Oklahoma. That's why the land rush, Sooners of Oklahoma, comes from the land rush that took place. But the Native Americans, that was, quote, going to be their state, Oklahoma. And so they were forced to sell their land to the United States government. And her husband was to go to the tribal leader, and pay him in cash. Well, they didn't understand money. So he counted out whatever he thought was fair, and fair to him, and took the rest of it. Finally, one of the Indian tribe gets a little bit suspicious and starts asking all the way up through Congress about, hey, we were only given this much money and we were promised this much. I have it, the one he hired an attorney said, I have it in writing. And they looked at it and they said, oh my gosh, he's stealing the money. He finds out through his liaisons in Congress that he's going to be indicted for embezzlement. He flees the country and is never seen again. He abandons his wife and daughter, and I think she was better off going, because she now is able to start cleaning up her financial situation and build a life of her own. For the next 6 years, yes.
How did she get control of her money since he disappeared?
Well,
she wasn't allowed to have.
It was in the United States, and with I think they declare him legally dead. He just vanishes. He never is found again.
Yeah.
And after that, she eventually gets control.
Okay.
That's a technical question.
That means I'm listening.
But Sara gets another really interesting opportunity after that bum leaves her. Her and her daughter are sent to Europe for a 5-year tour to write articles again. One of them is this. She writes a series of articles that she puts into this book, which is incidentally going to be back there for you to read, which is the biography of Queen Victoria. It becomes an immediate international bestseller. And she and her daughter have what I would say the time of their lives for the next 6 years. Publishing books, writing articles, visiting Paris. I just can't imagine. All the expenses are paid, and she's taken her, adult daughter with her.
What's her name, her daughter?
Annie Grace. We are now getting to the, we are now getting to the end of Sara's life, and she continues to write in the Ladies' Home Journal and the New York Independent until she's age 77. In 1900, she retires. She moves to New Rochelle, New York. On April 20th, 1904, Sara passes away. Her obituary appears on the front page of the New York Times, and it certainly attests to the fact that she was a woman, 19th century known woman celebrity at the time in 1904 when she passes away. What I've done with showing you these books, Sara is now being published again. You can do what I did and buy it and start reading her books again. And she's no longer an unknown woman celebrity. She's becoming an international seller again. And you can get her on Amazon.